Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. Of course, also at wichitaliberty.org, the Voice for Liberty, that's my site. You'll find all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, show notes for each episode, and then all the other material that myself and others produce there almost every day. Our guest today is Scot Rigby. He is Wichita Assistant City Manager and Director of Development. Started working for the city 2 years ago in July 2015, and prior to that, he held a similar position in Mesa, Arizona. So Scot, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV, and of course Karl, Peterjohn, our co-host. So, a big topic in Wichita going on right now is Naftzger Park. Most people know that as the small, quaint, I would say, park at Douglas and St. Francis by the Eaton Hotel. But the city has some new plans and goals for that. Could you fill our viewers in on what the city wants to do there?
Sure. Right now the city is out to the public right now taking public input. The desire is to look at and to consider what improvements that the public and the city want to consider making to Naftzger Park. We've heard from a lot of our citizens and residents and business owners in the area to say we'd like to take a look at that park and how do we potentially update it and make it friendly and welcoming and safe for everyone in Wichita.
And to do that, there is kind of a time schedule. City would like to have this done by March because of the basketball tournament games that'll be at Interest Bank Arena.
Two folds on that. We would like to get some substantial completion of the park, but we know the full park probably won't be done by March, simply because it's hard to do plantings in the winter.
Yeah.
So probably plantings will come sometime later in the spring. So probably early summer will be completion for the phase one of the park.
And I think a lot of people may not realize there are two phases contemplated. The $1.5 million we see is for phase one, and
Correct.
I think the phase two, they're talking about the same amount of money.
Correct, and what I'd say is there's no definitive timeline for that second phase. We're going to start with phase one, see how that goes, and see how the public responds to that. And then at a future date, the decision is to move forward with that second phase. Then the decision will be what's the funding, what the timing is for that second phase.
Is the second phase in your CIP?
Currently it is not.
And normally these types of upgrades for a project, wood park projects, whether it's a swimming pool or a water aspect or upgrading an existing park, normally those are CIP, aren't they?
Correct. So the first phase is within our capital improvement program, but the second phase is not.
Okay. So there's been a lot of controversy, as everybody knows, in the newspaper, letters to the editor, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people think Naftzger Park is just fine right now. So what's the big reason for changing, do you think, really?
I think it's a combination of different things. We've heard that from several people that, hey, the park's working great today, why do you want to do something? And I think at this point what we're trying to simply do is go out to the public and get input. If the decision at the end of the day by council says let's keep it as is, that's a decision the council can make. But right now the council has said go out as staff and take public input, take public open houses. We've had 4 of them. The last one was this morning. There'll be additional ones coming down the line, but they've been greatly attended. A lot of discussion, some heated at some times, some good discussions, a lot of questions about this or that, and that'll be something for the council and the park board to merit out and figure out what is the appropriate improvements to take place.
And to pay for this, the city wants to use tax increment financing. So how does that work, if you would?
Sure. Tax incremental financing is a process used across the country by many jurisdictions to do. And what it does is simply captures the incremental increase in property tax on an area that is defined within the tax incremental financing district. It's no new taxes. The tax rate stays the same. It's simply if there's an incremental increase. So if there's an incremental increase, the city can capture that and then reinvest that to pay off bonds for those improvements.
And in particular, right now, there's an empty building, the spaghetti warehouse, plus some vacant land right to the east of the park that's contemplated being redeveloped. And it's the incremental value from those, largely, that would go to pay for the TIF.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
There is some other existing property in the TIF too, and as that property gains in value, that increment would go to the TIF as well. Is that right?
Yes. Not necessarily, since the park is only 1.5 million, right now we're not going to look at what else can we do out there beyond the 1.5. The focus is what can we do with this first phase of the park.
Yeah.
Can the TIF generate enough revenue, because you've got existing TIFs for the arena TIF, I think was adopted in 2008. You've got the TIF that's Union Station immediately to the east that was adopted more recently, and that whole area had been pretty well covered with earlier TIFs, hadn't they?
There are several different TIFs in the downtown. This specific one is called the City Center
Center City
TIF District. And part of the process to do this, you have to do a calculated analysis. And what we believe on our calculation is this new development would generate appropriate enough funds to fund this first phase of the park.
Hold on to those ideas for
Sure.
a moment. Let's take a break here on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Karl Peterjohn, our special guest Scot Rigby of the city of Wichita this week, talking about Naftzger Park. So a lot of the times the justification for tax increment financing, or TIF, is that the area is blighted. Is that applicable to the Naftzger Park case?
You know, TIF has several different qualifications across the nation. Some are blighted, some are economic development, some are public benefit. At this point, it's not necessarily that we're saying it's a blighted area. It's simply an opportunity for us to look at, are there improvements that the city wants to consider? It's not a determination that we said that there's blight or not, because we think it's an adequate park today, but we're looking at, are there improvements that can even make it better and more of an enhancement to the community. So it's not necessarily that we deem this a blight. That's absolutely not one of the things that we've considered on this, but more of both economic development opportunity as well as how do we make the park available for all people to feel safe to use it regardless of where you live or work and play in the city.
Then another thing, I think one of the stated purposes of the city for wanting to redevelop this in a more open type of fashion is for a gathering space for concerts, events, and things like that. Karl, a couple of weeks ago we took a tour, a photographic safari, so to speak, of the areas to the south and west of Interest Bank Arena. There's a lot of vacant and underutilized land there, and it's an area that really hasn't seen much progress since the arena came in. The Naftzger Park area, you know, abuts Old Town, and the city, I think, rightly promotes Old Town as a success. The Douglas Corridor is, now we see that word as being success. But the areas to the south and west of the arena could really use something to jumpstart them. Did the city think about building a gathering space there?
We have not on the south side. Now, I know there are some private businesses that do gathering spaces on the south side to take advantage of what's going on in Trust. So that's currently taking place on some private property on the side, and we wish them the best of success, and we're not here to take away from that. We're just looking at an opportunity to build that, I'll call it that pedestrian corridor between the Interest Arena on the north side. You know, the county's doing some improvements to the Interest Arena because of the tournament and other activities. How do we build that corridor to move people back and forth without using cars? Nothing against cars, but how do we get people out of the cars to walk up and down Douglas, all the way from Old Town, down Douglas and over to the Interest Arena.
Yeah, and there is, of course, some stuff going on there with the Cargill building, and now in the Union Station there's a employer going to be located there. Karl, how much did the county spend on the new entryway to the arena? It was over $2 million, wasn't it?
It was, but I would hasten to add that the county acquired and paved it's right across from the Coleman Museum facility, a little bit further north, and so St. Francis, when you're talking about a corridor for pedestrian traffic, that provides a significant amount of parking for both Old Town as well as for the arena. And so Douglas isn't the only street within the city that I think has gotten some attention, and we've tried to do some upgrades, but it was several $1 million and taken out of the reserves that existed from the sales tax that funded the arena when it was in effect from 2005 to 2007.
And there's also something, Scott, there's I don't know if it's a dispute, but there seems like when Naftzger Park was developed, there was a mistake, and part of the park got developed over encroaching on land that is now privately owned. What about that?
Yes, it's an interesting thing that came to our knowledge. I guess back in the day when the park was developed, I don't know what exactly happened, but apparently we have built part of our city park on private property. We want to be respectful of private property rights, and as the private property is ready to do development, they approached us and said, technically your park sits on our property, what do you want to do with it? And obviously being respectful of private property, we said, absolutely, we've got to fix that. You have a right to develop your property, and we can't sit here and say it's a city park, tough. Right. And so we're working with the private developer to make sure that they get their property back so they can be productive with it. At the same time, that opens the door for us to look at how do we make this park work, not just for us, but for the surrounding area.
So this is the parking lot that's to the east of Naftzger Park, a strip along there. There's plans for something there, isn't there? Or
yeah, that parking lot is privately owned. It's part of the Spaghetti Works development. That'll all be developed into commercial and office space. And actually, the park space that's been developed is actually the green space on the east end. It's not just the parking lot, but actually into the park itself.
And so that brings to a criticism you see sometimes that this redesign is really just building a front yard for whatever's going to be built there in that parking lot. How does the city respond to that criticism?
You know, I think people may say that, but the reality is this park is for everybody. Whether you're the Eaton to the west, you know, the old Eaton Hotel there, or across the street in Douglas. The unique with the property to the east is there is no street, there's no public driveway between the park and the private property. So whatever we do, even if we never did anything and we simply said, hey, this is your private property line, you develop up to that, there's going to be immediate adjacentness of that park. And so we're trying to find how do you make it possible that they can be successful in their private space as well as this park that's going to have to be adjusted because of the private property issue. How does that adjust it to make it still a functional and highly effective park?
Okay, well, very good. Well, Scott, we're out of time for the first part of our show, so thank you very much, Scott Rigby, Assistant City Manager, for appearing today. And this is all going to happen pretty quickly, isn't it?
I think over the next few months, they'll start to roll forward. We're going to have several more meetings with the Parks Board, with Historic Preservation Design Council. There'll be more open houses as we start to narrow down those concepts into a particular one. And ultimately, hopefully in September, the council will make a determination which way to proceed. And if everything goes, decisions move forward, then the goal would be to have substantial completion by that March 2018 date.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. We'll take another commercial break and we'll be back in a couple moments. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm, of course, Bob Weeks with co-host Karl Peterjohn, and thanks to Scott Rigby, Assistant City Manager in charge of economic development and things, talking about Naftzger Park. So, Karl, you know, people are talking about the tax increment financing as though it was free money. Is that really the case, do you know?
Well, it really isn't free, and there's an old economist saying there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Some might remember that as the phrase Tannstoffel from a Robert Heinlein novel, but science fiction novel. But TIFs have been regularly used here in Wichita, and I think it's important. I used to call them TIF subsidy districts because basically the rest of the city has to provide, in effect, a way for that tax revenue to stay in that one location to do the special amenities or whatever features that they're going to do as part of that district. And there have been TIFs in different parts of the city, although most of them have been downtown. And interestingly enough, the history of it, Bob, they got started in an effort to try and solve the groundwater pollution problems back in the 1980s and 90s.
And what's interesting is that you know, the TIF, Scott Rigby said no new taxes, and that's kind of correct and kind of not correct. The developers of the property will be paying their full share of property taxes, but those taxes are redirected back to benefit them in a way. Now, I think in this case they're going to say not to benefit them, it's to redesign Naftzger Park, but I don't know if there would be such a rush to redesign Naftzger Park if not for this company wanting to do the redevelopment nearby.
And it gets into whose money and who controls it. And the sad thing about the TIF structure is it's very confusing for the average citizen out there.
And I think that's by design, because if the city just wrote checks to developers for millions of dollars, that's a pretty bald economic transaction. But when you hide it about redirecting future incremental tax increases subject to this and that, can only be used for certain allowable purposes, it all sounds very benign, like it's not really doing anything at all. We're told that we have to pay taxes, specifically property taxes a lot of times, to the city and the county, so that we can have police protection, fire protection, so we can send Mayor Karl to Ghana on trade missions, things like that. But these new developments will consume police and fire service, but yet their taxes are not going to pay for those.
Well, when you're in a situation where the clarity has been removed, and the problem you come up with, Bob, is what happens if the tax increment doesn't occur for whatever reason? Who ends up picking up the tab? And sadly, at that point, often it's the city itself. And this can happen also with special assessments. It's not limited to the TIF subsidy districts. But I used to call them subsidy districts, because if this was really such a good idea, Bob, that for development or for new development or redevelopment, why not make the whole community a TIF district?
Yeah, if there's really no cost to it, and that way, our friend John Todd can get a new garage too, if he can get a TIF district at his place too. But seriously, Karl, there have been TIF districts that have cost the city and quite a bit. The Old Town Cinema Tax District, that's the second TIF there, north of 2nd Street, where the Old Town Warren Theater is, and
where the Wichita Eagles relocated, I believe.
There too. That TIF district was underperforming, and the city issued to the Warren Theater Group a no-interest and low-interest loan so that they would not leave and thereby throw the TIF into a real financial hole. And then a couple years later, David Burke, who owns some of the property there, he represented himself as an agent of the city to appeal his tax assessments, which put the TIF under even more financial stress.
Well, that gets into the broader issue of the appraisal of property, which is a state function. The county has to administer it through the county appraiser, and individual property owners are supposed to be in the position of working with and understanding the appraisal process and saying, hey, is my property properly appraised so it can be assessed properly? And when you get into a TIF district, this all gets incredibly complicated, Bob.
Yeah. And then at 13th and Oliver, the former Kenmore Shopping Center was redeveloped using TIF funds.
Northwest corner.
Yeah. And when that did not go very well, even though the developer, a Methodist minister, had given a personal guarantee that if there's a TIF shortfall, I will make it up, well, the city nonetheless absorbed that debt into its debt service fund, in effect refinancing the TIF debt at a lower interest rate at a cost to the city and to the benefit of the TIF developers.
Well, this is where the problem with all these special benefits at special times, it's for some would say special folks, raises questions of propriety, and that's why I raise the point, because the state law basically says that the school districts in the TIF district and the county where the TIF district is located, if a city proposes a TIF district, the school district and the county each have 30 days, calendar days, to be able to vote to whether to reject that TIF subsidy district or not.
So they have veto power.
In effect, they can veto it. But what they can't do is, if they let that district get established, it can be established with just very general parameters. There is a boundary, but in terms of exactly how it's going to work and how it's going to be focused,
so they
the
have
city can come back. The city can come back later.
They have these redevelopment plans, which the city will consider Tuesday the 15th, and that really authorizes the spending of money on specific things, and the counties and school districts have no opportunity to object to that.
They get one bite of the apple within that 30-day time period, and after that, under state law, they are done. So this is a provision, Bob, that has moving parts involving both the state, city, county, and potentially the school districts. School districts normally don't get involved. We need to bring that up on our next segment.
Very good. Karl, we're overdue for a commercial break, so let's hurry up and take our last break. We'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to this last segment of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn, talking about Naftzger Park and kind of economic development in general. Karl, our record of using TIF in Wichita, matter of fact, economic development in general, look at the Water Walk project in downtown where the Gander Mountain store is, which is now
Going out of business.
or something's going to happen there. That was built with maybe $30 or so million of tax increment financing, but I think that most people would say that Water Walk is just a massive failure. Is that too harsh?
Well, we need to learn the lessons and look forward, I think, Bob, more than trying to allocate blame for decisions that were made over a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
And my focus, Bob, in terms of recommending it, would be what could we do to try and get the best use? And when I was on the county commission, I tried to use the criteria. If this was my own personal property, how would I handle it, or how would people in the private sector handle it if I was, say, in management of a corporation and they had this property? And so when the county had some excess parcels, like, for instance, earlier in the show we talked about the county's parking lot up on St. Francis. Well, the county actually had some property that was basically a parking lot on the north side of 2nd Street, and we put that up for auction, and we're very successful in getting it back into the private sector, back onto the tax rolls, and letting the private sector folks find the higher and best value and use for that property. We did this very successfully with a communications tower up on the north part of the county.
I remember that.
And when you talk about economic development, we in the government struggle in terms of pricing goods and services. We struggle with changes in that pricing structure depending upon demand and how much use is available. And so often, if we can, I think it's best to keep government limited and very specific in terms of its activities. And if we have excess property, whether it's a tower or whether it's land, sell it and get it into the private sector. We had land up in the northeast part of the county that we sold, and it's actually back at its highest and best function, which turns out it's basically growing crops.
Yeah. And I was really, I knew to the south and west of the arena that there was a lot of vacant and underutilized land, but when we went out a couple weeks ago and took photographs, I was really shocked at just how many vacant buildings there are, underutilized buildings.
Vacant lots, Bob.
Vacant lots that are not even converted into parking. And a car dealership that moved out not long after the arena opened, and that land's been vacant right across the street from the arena for all that time. It seems that those parcels could be picked up for a song, I think. They could use TIF down there too. It's in a TIF district already. And that is,
Well, that's the irony, Bob, because we had promises made that if we did the arena project, you were going to see all kinds of economic development that would follow, that would occur in and around that facility.
And there's been some
happened.
development down on Commerce Street, the artists and everything, but they're complaining that their taxes are too high now, their property taxes, and they want special relief from the city.
But, well, the Commerce Street case is interesting in the sense that I think it's really unconnected to the arena in any meaningful sense, and would have occurred regardless of what was happening elsewhere.
It was kind of picking up before the arena, I think.
Yeah.
But the arena really has not been the economic driver. And the TIF districts, too. I was going to mention the other TIF district that the Ambassador Hotel is in. Along William Street, the city built the parking garage with TIF, retail space on the ground floor. I think about only 1/4 of that is in use at this time. And then the Henry's building has been sitting there ready to go for many years, and nothing going on there.
Well, we have put almost all of downtown into the TIF district, and the irony is the small part of downtown that isn't in a TIF district, which is north of Douglas, just east of the river, has had quite a bit of redevelopment activities, and new apartments have gone in as part of the 250 West Douglas project, to mention one very successful
That's
redevelopment.
The big, tall former Holiday Inn Hotel.
At one time it had been part of the Holiday Inn that's in the Garvey Center complex, and the apartments that were built just northwest of that. So the challenge, I think, for local government, Bob, in terms of looking at specific area development, is, I think, to provide clear information and benefits, and having a competitive tax structure so that people can build on their dreams and not get bogged down with whether it's local government red tape, state or federal red tape. We can't control the state and feds as much, but do the best we can. But the broader question that we need to look at, I think, at the state end is with the changes that have occurred up in Topeka. The business climate in Kansas is going to be much more challenging in the future than it's been in the past.
And just to finish up in just a few seconds we have, you know, I'll put this up on the show notes for today, but over the past 10 years or so, since we've really been planning downtown, there's been over $1 billion of investment, both public and private, and yet the number of business firms, jobs, and the amount of payroll being paid to people has been declining since then, almost steadily.
But Bob,
there's a lot of people moving downtown, but as far as business activity, which is the way this was all sold, it's really on the decline.
Well, the challenge you didn't mention was tax base, in terms of private sector tax base, as opposed to, you've got valuation down there, but there's some of the new projects, for instance, the beautiful new downtown Y, it's a wonderful facility, but it's not on the tax base.
Yeah, so there are definitely problems with assessed value there. So, well, I want to say again, thank you to Scot Rigby, Assistant City Manager for Economic Development for the City of Wichita, for appearing today, and of course, Karl Peterjohn, thank you too. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you again next week.